Again, welcome to this opening session of teaching about the military in American history, presented by the FPRI's History Institute for Teachers in association with the 1st Division Museum and the Cantini 1st Division Foundation. I am David Eisenhower, co-chairman of FPRI's History Institute, which is surely one of the most dynamic and important of FPRI's programs in bringing together teachers and writers to exchange ideas about ways to teach and understand questions bearing on U.S. foreign policy, national security affairs, and international affairs. On behalf of the Philadelphia contingent and on behalf of us all, I would like to say thanks to Alan Luxembourg, Vice President of FPRI, for all he has done to arrange this conference. I would like to say particular thanks to the Annenberg Foundation, which has consistently provided generous and decisive support for the History Institute and its programs across the country, which have brought together teachers and writers from 43 states in all, despite the infancy of this program, including no fewer than 23 states, which are represented here this morning. I would like to say special thanks to the 1st Division Museum and to the Cantini 1st Division Foundation and to Colonel Dr. Paul Herbert, Executive Director of the Foundation, a foremost expert on military affairs, who will address the conference this afternoon. I think it is safe to say that any American with awareness of the 20th century U.S. history and military affairs feel a bond with the U.S. 1st Division, which continues to accumulate battle ribbons and honors in America's critical conflicts overseas. The museum and foundation exist to expand awareness of the 1st Division, and they do quite a job, thanks to, again, Colonel Dr. Herbert. And thanks to him also, a number of early arriving participants last night were able to exchange notes. In many cases, participants at this conference have a personal link with the U.S. 1st Division, including our first speaker this morning, Dr. McDougall, Walter McDougall of the University of Pennsylvania, who is co-chairman of the History Institute. He is known to everyone in this room as a foremost, perhaps in my view, the foremost American historian, whose artillery unit operated with the 1st Division north of Saigon in 1968-1969, which I had not known and found out last night. Finally, thanks to all who have traveled long distances to be here, I think we will all agree that it has been worth the journey to have this chance to exchange views about the teaching and understanding of military affairs in this beautiful and unique setting. Without further ado, Dr. Walter McDougall to begin this conference with an overview of war and military affairs in American history.
Thank you very much, David, Colonel Herbert, and welcome to all of you secondary school teachers. Colonel Herbert anticipated me because at past FPRI History Institutes, I also have praised as well as thanked the teachers in attendance. I always liken them to frontline soldiers in the war. What war? The war to prove that the ignorance of America's youth is not invincible. And our subject this weekend clearly makes that simile especially apt. And therefore, in my capacity as a college professor and my capacity as a high school parent, I salute your heroic calling. Now, my first task in this first session is to offer some general remarks on how to think about war and the military in the broad sweep of American history. Remarks that I hope will be heuristic, but also provocative, which is why I have chosen to open the conference with a certain provocative film clip.
Dead, fight! Be seated. I want you to remember that no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country. Men, all this stuff you've heard about America not wanting to fight, wanting to stay out of the war, is a lot of horse dung. Americans traditionally love to fight. All real Americans love the sting of battle. When you were kids, you all admired the champion marble shooter, the fastest runner, big league ball players, the toughest boxers. Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. Americans play to win all the time. I wouldn't give a hoot in hell for a man who lost and laughed. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war, because the very thought of losing is hateful to Americans. Now, an army is a team. It lives, eats, sleeps, fights as a team. This individuality stuff is a bunch of crap. The bilious bastards who wrote that stuff about individuality for the Saturday Evening Post don't know anything more about real battle than they do about fornicating. Now, we have the finest food and equipment, the best spirit, and the best men in the world. You know, by God, I actually pity those poor bastards we're going up against. By God, I do. We're not just going to shoot the bastards. We're going to cut out their living guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks. We're going to murder those lousy Hun bastards by the bushel. Now, some of you boys, I know, are wondering whether or not you'll chicken out under fire. Don't worry about it. I can assure you that you will all do your duty. The Nazis are the enemy. Wade into them. Spill their blood. Shoot them in the belly. When you put your hand into a bunch of goo that a moment before was your best friend's face, you'll know what to do. Now, there's another thing I want you to remember. I don't want to get any messages saying that we are holding our position. We're not holding anything. Let the Hun do that. We are advancing constantly, and we're not interested in holding on to anything except the enemy. We're going to hold on to him by the nose, and we're going to kick him in the ass. We're going to kick the hell out of him all the time, and we're going to go through him like crap through a goose. Now, there's one thing that you men will be able to say when you get back home, and you may thank God for it. 30 years from now, when you're sitting around your fireside with your grandson on your knee, and he asks you, what did you do in the great World War II? You won't have to say, well, I shoveled shit in Louisiana. All right, now you sons of bitches, you know how I feel. Oh. I will be proud to lead you wonderful guys into battle anytime, anywhere. That's all.
I Googled General Patton's famous speech to the Third Army and learned Hollywood severely Bowdlerized it. The real address scarcely contains a sentence without an obscenity or a bloody oath. I encourage you to check it out. Of course, Patton was trying to encourage, literally instill courage in, nervous young men about to storm Hitler's West Wall. So the sentiments he expressed were suited more to a football locker room pep talk than to a 4th of July oration. Nevertheless, Patton had a point when he cried, "Americans traditionally love to fight." Indeed, the popular author Jeffrey Parrott even titled his American history "A Country Made by War." And if that is so, then Americans simply must affirm their military and their wars, because without them, the great nation we inhabit today wouldn't exist. The United States was born in an armed revolution. The Union was saved in a great civil war. The nation achieved its manifest destiny and world power largely through war. Perhaps Americans are not more belligerent than other great nations, but they certainly are not less belligerent. In our brief 230-year history, the United States has waged at least a dozen major wars and scores of minor conflicts on the frontier and overseas. The United States today spends more on defense than the next 6 great powers combined, and stations armed forces of some variety in over 100 countries. The United States is a militant republic. The American creed is a fighting faith. And our politics and foreign policy have been driven, as often as not, by the fact or the fear of war. Moreover, we teachers cannot even describe the main social, economic, or cultural trends in American history without frequent reference to war and the military. One need only name the abolition of slavery, establishment of the income tax, the triumph of women's suffrage, the civil rights movement, the youth rebellion of the 1960s, to suggest how great transformations have been partly driven by wars. The only comparable influence, I think, in United States history has been that of evangelical religion. Whether or not Americans really romance war, at least when we like our odds and deem the fruits of victory worth the risk, we certainly do love to study it. At University of Pennsylvania, the courses in military and diplomatic history attract up to 10 times the number of students who enroll in a cultural or a social history class. Cable TV's History Channel obsesses on World War II and the Civil War to the exclusion of almost everything else. Best-selling histories are disproportionately concerned with wars and war leaders. I think there have been 4 new biographies of Ulysses S. Grant just in the last 5 or 6 years. Blockbuster movies are often about historical wars or else fantasy fights of the Star Wars or Star Trek or Lord of the Rings variety. And look at the Game Boy, Nintendo, or PlayStation titles, and you encounter what? Ubiquitous combat, be it in outer space, Bowser's Islands, or ghetto streets. Now, what does all that tell us about ourselves and our country? I don't know. Or at least I do know the American people are too disparate, complex, perhaps schizophrenic to be caricatured. Looking at their history, Americans are surely proud of the soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen who have defended their liberty and national honor. Americans thrill to the victories they won and mourn the trials suffered by servicemen and their families. But at the same time, Americans are loath to glorify war, which is why a clip like this makes us a little uncomfortable. And Americans are quick to imagine military service as somewhat alien to civilian values. We Americans, we worship at the altars of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We cherish equality, civility, and compromise. All of those seem to be directly contradicted by the discipline, duty, hierarchy, and coercion characteristic of military life. Indeed, military service, whether it's performed by professionals, by conscripted citizens, or by volunteer militia, invariably strikes Americans as abnormal. If civilians are called to the colors, they deem it an interruption, born of an emergency thrust upon our nation by some wicked enemy, an emergency to be gotten over with as quickly as possible and as violently as necessary, so that citizens can return to their hometowns, their families, and their jobs, their pursuit of happiness. If, by contrast, professionals fill the ranks of their armed forces, then Americans tend, this is not universal, but the tendency of Americans is to view them, these professionals in the military, as a kind of a caste apart, as if they were a fighting order of monks who forego the blessings of civil society so that the rest of us can continue to enjoy them. Thus, fighting men and women take on a sacred, even a sacrificial character in what I like to call the American civil religion. Now, these thoughts may strike some of you as vague, speculative, and certainly generalized. But I submit that they already suggest three enduring themes that are not vague at all, and which I believe we would do well to follow up on this weekend. One theme is the cultural gap between the military and civil society, a gap that has waxed and waned since colonial times, but has become a growing concern since the draft was abolished in favor of an all-volunteer force. The military and civil cultures have, ever since then, diverged to the point that they barely intersect anymore, which many observers consider very unhealthy for both the military and civil society. A related theme is the hallowed American principle of civil supremacy. General Matthew B. Ridgway voiced the military's proper deference when he said, "The soldier is the statesman's junior partner." It was statesman Theodore Roosevelt who expressed the heretical view that the diplomat is the servant, not master, of the soldier. We should also, following up on this tradition of civil supremacy, take pride in the truly amazing fact, if you go back through the whole sweep of history, that a military coup has never been a serious threat to our republic, even when some civilians urged George Washington and George McClellan to make one. It's also extraordinary that insubordination, for instance, perhaps that of Douglas MacArthur, some would argue, has been very rare in our history. Still, there's no question tensions have always existed between politicians and the uniformed brass, especially at times when the armed forces were demoralized, either because the government starved them of resources or made impossible demands on them. A third theme is simply that ambivalence about war displayed by American citizens. As philosopher Georges Santayana put it, to delight in war is meritorious in the soldier, dangerous in the captain, and criminal in the statesman. Throughout most of our history, Americans have honored their veterans and boasted, at least until Vietnam, of never having lost a war, and some of us would even dispute whether we really lost that one. Moreover, throughout our history, most Americans like to believe that their nation's record in war was providential, that the fact that Americans never lose a war, that was a sign of divine favor and proof that our causes were just. And yet, on the other hand, few Americans wanted to believe their country was eager to fight or was responsible for the outbreak of any war. On the contrary, Americans imagined themselves a peace-loving people. Well, were they fooling themselves? as maybe Patton would have it, about being a peace-loving people? Well, let's do a quick survey with those popular self-images and those themes in mind and see what we find. We discover at once that a certain duality toward war was present at the creation of the 13 colonies. I spied it quite literally a few years ago when my family took advantage of an unusually warm winter day to promenade in Philadelphia's Fairmount Park on the north bank of the Schuylkill River. And at one point, we passed a series of old WPA monuments that had been put up featuring representative American colonists. And the central monument included two dominating figures sort of half facing each other. One was a stereotypical Quaker in his broad-brimmed hat and coat, and he held in his hand a book, presumably the Bible. The other figure was a stereotypical Puritan in his peaked buckled hat and Calvinist garb. He held in his hand a musket. The Puritans hit American soil not wanting to fight Indians or anybody else, but absolutely ready to do so if necessary for their self-defense or for expansion, especially against the hated French Catholics up in Quebec. As we know, the Puritans waged bitter, successful war on the violent Pequot tribe as early as 1637, and a Native American coalition led by Metacomb, or King Philip, in 1675. After 1688, when Parliament ousted the Stuart kings and established the Protestant Whig ascendancy in England, New Englanders cheered John Churchill's crusade to crush the French and Spanish empires and conquer all North America. Thus began the long series of French and Indian wars that colonists later claimed they were dragged into, but in fact all supported, except for the pacifist Quakers. Down in the Chesapeake Bay and Carolina, the so-called Cavaliers, the semi-aristocratic planters and their indentured servants, proved just as eager to fight for defense and for empire. And indeed, their most famous son, Colonel Washington, would even be blamed for sparking the climactic French and Indian War when he ambushed an enemy column on the Pennsylvania frontier in 1754. And as for the hundreds of thousands of Scots-Irish, this is McDougall speaking here, who fanned out across the Appalachians, for them, feuding and war were simply their way of life. To be sure, the people who invented America sought economic opportunity. They craved civil and religious liberty. But except for the Quakers and the German Mennonites, Americans always reacted with fury against anyone who dared interfere with or place limits upon their pursuit of happiness. At such times, Americans instinctively reached for their muskets with a deadly earnestness born of impatience. Nothing so illustrated the centrality of the military to the American identity as the role played by the Continental Army. From 1775 to 83, Washington's threadbare, unpaid, often hungry band of volunteers was the United States of America for all practical purposes, because the Army was the only national institution besides an impotent, feckless committee called Congress. Washington's genius was less as a tactician than as a paragon of the Republican general, exhorting reluctant troops, refraining from requisitioning civilian property even as his army suffered, deferring to politicians in Congress, which he held in contempt most of the time, accepting no pay for himself, and above all by resigning his commission after victory rather than succumbing to the temptations of a Caesar or a Napoleon. So indispensable was Washington and the sort of army that he fashioned that soon after independence, the Federalist movement arose to promote a new constitution in order to make Washington chief magistrate and to forge a strong central government and credible military. Revolutionary War veterans comprised a large block of the delegates at the Philadelphia Convention. And the first 29 of the 85 Federalist Papers argued for ratification of the Constitution on the grounds of defense and foreign policy. John Jay wrote, "The United States proved their very existence by having waged war as a nation, vanquished their enemies as a nation, and made foreign treaties as a nation." He wrote that government's primary responsibility was to protect the people from foreign invasion and foreign influence. He reminded the readers of the Federalist of the proximity of the British Empire up in Canada, the Spanish Empire to the south, and the likelihood of future rivalry with the French. Thus did Jay implicitly scorn the notion that the United States could ever fancy itself isolated. Indeed, he insisted nothing would invite war so much as for the 13 states to fall into feeble disunion. Alexander Hamilton likewise demolished the conceit known today as democratic peace theory, to wit, that self-governing peoples are by nature peaceful and do not make war on other self-governing peoples. Hamilton instead cited the long list of wars waged by Republican Sparta, Republican Athens, Republican Carthage, Republican Rome in the ancient world, and the Venetian Republic, Dutch Republic, and parliamentary England in modern times. He concluded, "There have been, if I may so express it, almost as many popular wars as royal ones." Hamilton asked by what fallacy Americans believed they were somehow exempt from the, quote, "imperfections, weaknesses, and evils incident to society in every shape," unquote. But the fact that Americans were not immune to aggressiveness or folly hardly meant that they should dispense with a standing military altogether, as many of the anti-federalists contended. Indeed, wrote Hamilton, "a prohibition against raising armed forces in peacetime, quote, would exhibit the most extraordinary spectacle the world has yet seen, that of a nation incapacitated by its own constitution to prepare for defense until it was invaded," unquote. The Federalists were even more adamant about the need for a permanent navy, lest American commerce be made a prey even in peacetime and America's coasts be exposed in wartime. Yes, there was always the danger that a standing military might be used by the executive in the manner of the Redcoats as an oppressive force against the people. But the framers of the Constitution, as you know, minimized that risk by checking and balancing the powers to raise and command armed forces, declare wars, and ratify treaties. Above all, Federalists remained adamant that the identity and the survival of the Union depended on its power to make war. The Democratic-Republican Party that arose in the 1790s professed to reject all that. But after they captured the presidency in 1801, they quickly learned otherwise. To be sure, Thomas Jefferson slashed military spending. He said we need only rely on militias in case of invasion. He decommissioned John Adams' proud frigates in favor of a fleet of little gunboats. But Jefferson was enough of a scientist to realize the Army needed an expert corps of engineers. It was Jefferson, therefore, who founded the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1802. And it was Jefferson's protege, James Madison, who led the United States into its first discretionary war in 1812, and Madison emerged from it a strong proponent of the professional military and of federal arsenals. There followed a long period of relative peace. Except for the conflicts attending Indian removal and the Texans' private war for independence, Americans didn't wage serious war again until the Mexican conflict in 1846. And over those decades, Andrew Jackson placed his own ambiguous stamp on the American military. As a Scots-Irish frontier chieftain, Andrew Jackson literally picked fights whenever he could. Patton would have loved the guy. Quintessential America. In 1817, Jackson invaded Spanish Florida, the first, I might add, in a series of preemptive strikes that have speckled American history. But as a politician, Jackson was a follower of Jefferson, and he too claimed that militias were enough to defend the nation in case of a big conflict, only to learn otherwise once he entered the White House. It was Andrew Jackson who called West Point the finest school in America, even when his own Democratic supporters in Congress proposed shutting down the academy. It was Jackson who presided over a modest expansion of the Frontier Army, especially its excellent mounted dragoons and corps of topographical engineers. Not least, Jackson, a landsman from the mountains of Tennessee, quickly understood as president that nothing guarded America's honor abroad better than a strong navy. And indeed, finally, when Jackson's protege, James K. Polk, waged our next discretionary war against Mexico, the professional army and professional navy distinguished themselves while the militias performed miserably. That war established once and for all the reputations of West Point and of the new Naval Academy at Annapolis. But Mexico did not purge America of the myth of the citizen soldier. On the contrary, Congress clung to its habit of slashing defense budgets in peacetime, with the result that when the southern states seceded in 1861, the nation again went to war unready and on the cheap. And yes, West Point graduates filled most of the top ranks in both armies, but otherwise the Civil War replicated the nation in arms model of volunteers called to the colors to fight for their hearth and home. After Appomattox, and especially after the Grand Army of the Republic and Sons of the Confederacy burnished their respective myths, Americans forgot the initial amateurishness of Civil War recruits, the panicky flights of whole units, the incompetent campaigns and botched maneuvers of political generals. They preferred to remember the heroism of the citizen soldiers and the ultimate glory and tragedy of their respective causes. Those memories, those partial myths, were reinforced by the events of the next 100 years, years during which the United States rose to world power. To be sure, in the late 19th century, the boom in U.S. foreign trade and the so-called new imperialism pursued by the Europeans and then the Japanese persuaded first admirals and then congressmen and then presidents the United States had to build a modern steel navy sustained by its first military-industrial complex. Likewise, the Army, and especially the Marines, expanded during the decades when Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson intervened repeatedly in the Caribbean and the Pacific. But when big wars broke out, the Spanish War in 1898, both world wars, and the Cold War conflicts in Korea and Vietnam, once again, it was volunteer and conscripted civilians who filled the ranks of America's instantly expanded armies and navies. Then, finally, during the latter half of the 20th century, the pattern was broken, for better or worse. Broken by two paradigm shifts that punctured, probably forever, the realities and the myths of the military and war in America. The first was the transition from a merely industrial era of warfare to the post-industrial era, characterized by the phrase, the revolution in military affairs. Industrial age warfare placed a premium on huge, indifferently trained infantry armies, cannon fodder, if you will, and on mass production of relatively low-tech, by today's standards, relatively low-tech weapons, such as rifles, machine guns, tanks, ships, and airplanes, whose sheer numbers wore down our enemies. Post-industrial war, by contrast, places a premium on relatively small, highly trained, and very mobile strike forces armed with high-tech, very high-tech weapons of unprecedented lethality and accuracy, guided by integrated computer systems linked to orbiting satellites. President Nixon might have abolished the draft to drain the passion from the anti-war protests, but his shift to professional armed forces went hand in hand with the progress of technology in the late 20th century. The second paradigm shift was the simultaneous advent over those decades of the protracted conflict and the limited war. From 1946 to 1991, the American people were asked to support a long twilight struggle to contain or roll back the communist menace led by the Soviet Union, and doing all that without triggering a Third World War. And when the Cold War turned hot in Korea, and later in Vietnam, Americans were therefore asked to fight and die with no expectation of an early or total victory. Protracted conflict and limited war made expensive, frustrating demands on our nation to which it was not accustomed. If forced to fight, Americans want to kick maximum butt and go home. The Cold War and now the War on Terror have not given Americans what they want. While at the same time, those wars have required a professional, high-tech military in which the citizen soldier has almost no place. The United States today is defended by the postmodern equivalents of Roman legionnaires and centurions, which is another reason why pundits write today of the American Republic giving way to American empire. Some cheer the prospect and others deplore it. Okay, pocket biography of the military and war in American history. What does it suggest? It suggests three more pregnant themes for the weekend. First, the American way of war, to employ historian Russell Weigley's apt term. Second, the changes in the American way of war caused by technological and strategic or geopolitical shifts. And thirdly, the difficulty American culture, we, have in accepting reality or adjusting to changes in the reality of the American way of war. Because at heart, we're still a nation of Minuteman patriots, at heart. Peaceful until aroused, and then a righteous nation in arms. Just recall what we felt on 9/11. Weeping, fearing, but rising as one, full of spit and vinegar, ready to sacrifice, wanting to sacrifice, and hot, of course, for vengeance and for justice. We didn't get our chance, we civilians. We've been passed by. Nobody wants a Minuteman anymore. But in truth, looking back over that whole sweep of history, in truth, that Minuteman culture was already partly a myth in 1775, on the very day when Washington took command of the Minuteman militias outside of Boston and began whipping them into an army. Throughout the 19th century, the Minuteman culture remained partly mythical because the pioneer trails westward and the pioneering acts that brought Americans overseas, those trails were blazed by the professional soldiers and professional sailors. And the Minuteman culture became mostly mythical during the late 20th century as technology underwent its revolutionary changes and the security threats to the United States shifted from conventional war to nuclear war to guerrilla war to terrorist war. Accordingly, the Pentagon came to decide it no longer needed or wanted the citizen soldier. And yet, there's a certain irony in this great transition in the last 50 years or so. And maybe I'm wrong about this, but it seems to me that the American public has become less tolerant of American casualties than it was during the eras when tens of thousands of civilian drafted soldiers became casualties in our wars. Why, if we have a small professional military, do we mourn 300 or 3,000 dead? We didn't mourn 300,000 dead, even in the days when our own sons and brothers were being drafted into the service. It's a curious phenomenon. I think Americans today are even less tolerant of enemy and collateral casualties than ever before. In 1943, 44, 45, who mourned for the hundreds of thousands of Japanese and German civilians who were incinerated by the Army Air Forces? Nobody. They had it coming. Besides, victory through attrition inflicted by superior firepower, that was the American way of war. It had been the American way of war ever since U.S. Grant in the Wilderness, and indeed, I would argue, ever since the latter stages of the War of 1812. But now, more sensitive or maybe less confident Americans ponder what makes us feel more uncomfortable. A short march to Baghdad in which just 200 Americans die as compared to some 10,000 Iraqis? Or are we rendered more uncomfortable by a long insurgency in which 3,000 Americans die as compared to 100,000 Iraqis? Interesting question. Interesting psychological issue that I'm not really prepared to answer or to address. In conclusion, though, let me return to the original conundrum, born of Patton's claim that Americans love a fight and Americans' own insistence that we're really a peace-loving people. It occurred to me that maybe the way to parse that puzzle is by drafting a simple chart that juxtaposes the foreign and the domestic sources of America's major wars. And before this session began, it was passed out to you, and I'm certainly not going to walk through it war by war or read for you what you can read yourselves. Don't you hate PowerPoint presentations where somebody puts up a slide with 4 bullets on it and then reads them, one by one? You can see it yourself. You don't need the person to read it to you. So I'm not going to read this through for you. You can look at it at your leisure, and perhaps during breaks and whatnot, meals, we can have fun debating some of these case studies. But what I think we discover in this summary or breakdown of our nation's major wars is not one, but three surprisingly valid generalizations. Yes, just as we have always liked to believe, the United States has been thrust into conflict by some real or apparent foreign assault. And that fact, perhaps, also helps to explain our tendency to enter wars often woefully ill-prepared, or else our tendency to try to get by with less force than is necessary until we finally wake up to the requirements of a given war. This unpreparedness for war and then attempt to get by with less than we need is a phenomenon my colleague at FPRI, Harvey Zickerman, calls cheap hawkery. But there is also reason, secondly, to entertain the observation that some historians have made that Americans' real tendency is less to avoid war than to maneuver, provoke, or through weakness, tempt their opponents into firing the first shot. Interesting. Diplomatic historians, of course, endlessly debate the origins of wars, and in almost every case you can find historians who will argue that, well, yes, the Spaniards provoked the war because of what they were doing in Cuba, or sunk the battleship Maine, or didn't really sink the battleship Maine, or the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, or the Germans submarines sank our ships in World War I. We were provoked into these wars, but we, in a sense, provoked them into engaging in these provocations, which then gave us the pretext for a war. That's another way of looking at this. Finally, in the run-up to almost every major war, the historian discovers that the United States, while perhaps displaying a majority for peace or a consensus for peace, nevertheless also contained, in every case, an overt or covert war party, actively promoting American belligerency. Most obvious case being the Hearst newspaper chain, beating the drums for war against Spain for several years prior to the Maine blowing up and the ultimate declaration of war. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm suggesting that you can come up with conspiracy theories to explain how America really is guilty for our wars or maneuvered to get into them? No, not at all. I'm simply observing that from the hot-headed Bostonians of the 1770s to the fire eaters in South Carolina in 1860 to the neoconservatives of our own day, war parties have been a staple of American politics and foreign relations. Do Americans love a fight, as Patton insisted? In the end, it doesn't really matter, because it seems we are destined to fight, whether we like it or not. And that sad fact was driven home to me by a certain Ivy Day plaque on the wall of the Student Union at the University of Pennsylvania. Expressed that fact with resignation and pathos. Now, Ivy Day at Penn every spring was a day when the graduating seniors would plant a sprig of ivy along the walls of one of the buildings and then have a plaque, class of 1932 or what have you. It's part of Penn's attempt to persuade Harvard, Yale, and Princeton that we were really Ivy League. That's true. But in the length of time, I don't know exactly when it occurred, but before I came to Penn, the civil engineers discovered that the ivy was ripping up the sandstone walls and the mortar and damaging the integrity of the outside walls of the buildings at the university, so the ivy has disappeared. No more ivy is planted, but the plaques, of course, remain on all the buildings around campus. And one day while walking to class, one of them caught my eye because of my high school Latin. I wanted to see what it had to say, and the inscription read thusly: Vivere militari est. To live is to fight. My eye immediately ran to the bottom to check the date, and my hunch was confirmed. The plaque was signed, University of Pennsylvania, class of 1945. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Walter. You'll take some questions. Questions, Walter, you'll take directly from the audience. However, we do have a webcast audience viewing this online, and if you see my hand go up, it means that there's someone online who would like to pose a question. To those in the webcast audience who are viewing this online, to ask a question, all you need to do is post your question in the box on your video screen. So now we will take some questions.
Okay, I will entertain not only questions, but also cries of outrage, learned critiques of any of my points, disputations about the chart, any comments or questions that you may have about these grand themes concerning the war and the military in the sweep of American history. I know you're not intimidated. Sir.
Yes, sir. My name is Lieutenant Colonel retired George Kakaisen. I teach junior ROTC in North Carolina. I agree wholeheartedly on this disparaging between the military culture and the civilian culture. I've been teaching junior ROTC now for 14 years, and I can see a trend that's developing quite clearly. The kids that are enlisting in the military come from military families. Those kids who have no military background whatsoever shun the military like it's some sort of a plague. I cannot see any time in our future where a draft would ever be accepted by the American people again. Howsoever, one of the writing requirements I give to my juniors has to do with a hypothetical bill called National Public Service, where for 2 years after high school, every student is required to provide 2 years of service to their country, whether it be building houses, Habitat Humanity, serving in a VA hospital, or joining one of the military services. Surprisingly, 90% of the students object to that totally. It infringes upon their right to choose what they want to do with their lives. I think it's a very disturbing trend. I don't really have an answer for where we go from here, but you're right on the button as far as this disparaging problem. The civilian world has no concept of what the military families endure or provide to this country anymore. America has no equity in the military.
Thank you. I certainly agree, although I must say I'm surprised at your figure of, was it, you said 90% of young people don't like the idea of national service?
Correct.
I'm shocked and dismayed to hear that number. I would have thought it would have been at least 50-50. I mean, you expect young people to have a certain idealism, right, and social conscience and desire to sort of contribute to make the world a better place. I've always sort of taken for granted that that's one of the characteristics of youth. But you're telling me that's not so anymore. And is that a national poll, or is that North Carolina?
That's just from my high school itself. And
well, that makes it even more disturbing. Even the sons of the South, the daughters of the South don't want to contribute?
From the heart of the South.
Oh, boy.
It has to do with, I think, a holdover from the 60s, where everything is give me because I am. And no one really has interest in helping the country anymore. And you get that right from our congressmen, as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
They're not there to be they're there to be just politicians, not to be diplomats or any kind of people who really serve the American people anymore. It's all for power and me.
I've read articles showing the precipitous decline in the percent of members of Congress who have themselves served in the military. It used to be almost taken for granted that, I mean, obviously being a war hero or a war veteran was a good campaign advantage, but even without that, it's just in the era of the military draft, a large number of young men, particularly, served in the service, and if they went into politics, all right, they understood the military. When they went to Congress, they understood the needs of the military and how the military culture perhaps differed in some respects, and there was the merging of the two cultures and the cooperation between the two cultures could be much more easily achieved. That's not the case anymore. And Colin Powell has been spoken eloquently about this danger, and others. And if we're not going to bring back a draft, I don't know how the gap can be bridged again. But if the gap is not bridged, and the military becomes more and more of this kind of separate order of fighting monks or nuns, I guess. You know what I mean? There's this holy order almost of cast apart from the rest of society, and civil society becomes increasingly selfish and individualistic in Patton's sense. And the military does all the suffering to allow that, everyone else to sort of, live their personal hedonistic lives. Yeah, you've got a real danger to the republic there in the long run. There's nothing in history that says the United States is immortal. And if you look at regimes, whether they're republics or monarchies or dictatorships, any kind of regime, if you look at the history of regimes throughout history, not many regimes survive, longer than what the United States has already survived. Or, as the French say, societies go through crise de régime, crises, great crises of survival every century or so. And we've only had one, the Civil War. Some people would say the 60s was a kind of a crise de régime, but it certainly didn't threaten the integrity of the republic the way the Civil War did. So it might be that in the long run, in the long sweep of time, the United States is due for a real serious crisis, maybe even a crack-up or a coup d'etat or some kind in the century to come. There's nothing in history that says that's not going to happen, unless we are being watched over by Providence. And so this question of the role of the military in American society, this absolutely fundamental, the military is absolutely fundamental to our survival. We can't get by without it in the world, or our security depends on it. And yet, if the military is somehow rendered separate and unequal, if you will, in American society, and turned into a kind of a mercenary force, the military is not going to have a stake in the survival of the civil society, and the civil society is going to begin to fear and detest the very people who protect it. See what I mean? So that's the big picture danger over the next century. And I hope, I don't expect to get much out of Congress on this issue, which means that we're going to be fortunate in having a president of either party, either gender. But we're going to need a president somewhere down the line who does understand this problem and is somehow able to figure out ways of bridging the gap. Did you have a question online?
Well, this is related to what you just said. We have from Steve Plotkin in the greater Philadelphia area, should ROTC be far greater emphasized as a way to engage the 99% of the population which is non-military today?
It's tempting. I mean, I've obviously, I'm a college professor, and so, and a veteran. So when I see uniforms walking around campus, I feel good. Good. These are students. They're student soldiers or student sailors. The way we pretend that our football players are student athletes, right? Well, these really are student soldiers or student sailors, and they personify the bridging of the two cultures, the civilian and the military. And they are walking role models or challenges to all the other kids. So I'm very much in favor of ROTC as a presence on campuses. Of course, I taught at Berkeley for 13 years, where they burned down the ROTC building while I was there. The radicals did. But on the other hand, as to whether the ROTC perhaps should be expanded as a way of addressing this problem, I don't know the answer to that, because that's a manpower or a person power issue. I don't know if the Pentagon needs more officers, and if so, whether the ROTC is the way that the Pentagon would prefer to generate them. I don't know the answer to that. We have these images which are thoroughly subjective and probably unfair. When I was in Vietnam, my experience was as an artillery sergeant that the best officers were the OCS officers. Now, this is a long time ago in another world, another century. So I don't know I don't know what the case is today. But the OCS officers actually, to us, seem to have the best combination of competence, leadership, and a kind of a sensitivity toward us citizen soldiers. The ROTC officers certainly were sensitive to us as citizen soldiers, but they weren't very well trained. They weren't very competent, or they didn't have strong leadership skills, in my experience. The West Pointers were far and away the most competent, but they didn't relate well to, Joe and Harry drafted off the block or volunteering from the farm. It was the spit and polish, or it was the kind of the real ramrod, backbone type of West Pointer that we feared the most. We didn't want them as our officers. Now that's just a generalization. I don't know what the stereotypes are today, but I can speak to the issue of ROTC as a presence on campus, which I consider to be extremely healthy. Yes, ma'am.
In your original conundrum, you presented the idea that there's a sort of paradox between the aspect of America that seems to be war-loving and the aspect of America that seems to be peace-loving. In the way that I've looked at U.S. military history as a teacher of high school students, I've always been very interested in the trend which seems to suggest a relationship between American self-interest and American idealism as it's presented through the rhetoric. And these things seem to be contradictory as well as complementary. And I'm wondering if you see a relationship between that and your original conundrum, and if you see this as something that might be changing in the way that Americans are responding.
Whoa.
Sorry.
You've outlined about 3 books there. Very deep questions. And I'll just free associate and hope that I sort of stumble into something that's relevant to your concerns. Yes, there's always been this tension between idealism and self-interest, or geopolitical interest, or strategy, balance of power, whatever you want to call it, in American foreign policy. It's partly, however, a construction of people who debate the wisdom or the morality of given foreign policies and wars. The reason, my point being this: no statesman, not even Woodrow Wilson, would get up and say, "Well, I'm an idealist. I don't care about the national interest or reality." No, he would say, "My idealism amounts to a higher realism." That the old realism, the balance of power, imperialism, war, we have to get beyond that. And my ideas and my principles and League of Nations and all the rest represent a higher realism. That's what a Wilsonian would say. Whereas if you went to Teddy Roosevelt and said, "I understand you're just a realist and you don't have any ideals at all," Teddy would punch you in the face, wouldn't he? Every president is going to pretend or to shape, and this is where rhetoric becomes very important, a foreign policy that appeals both to Americans' sense of this is in our self-interest, but it also serves our ideals as a nation. That is what we hire our politicians to do, to persuade us or fool us into believing that what we're doing abroad is both the right thing to do and the smart thing to do. And if they can't persuade us of that, then they're not doing a good job as our leaders. And now, how does this play into the question of do we like to fight or are we a peace-loving people? And of the role of the military. The question of whether the American citizenry are being asked to sacrifice in a given foreign conflict, I think, is a key variable. It's not the only variable, but it's a key variable. You cannot wage what old-fashioned diplomats would call a cabinet war, a war of strategy pursued by government for realistic balance of power purposes or for some material gain. You cannot fight such a war with a large conscripted army. Your people, if you're calling upon your whole nation or even part of your nation who don't want to be in the military to go and risk their lives for some war the government has chosen to fight, that automatically in a republic means that the leaders have to persuade the people that this was either forced on us, we have no choice but to fight, or that we are fighting for some great cause that represents our national ideals. You can't fight. You can't send a drafted army into the jungles of Vietnam and say that we're fighting some kind of a maneuver here to prevent dominoes from falling and so forth. You have to be fighting to democratize the Middle East and some great cause. Now that we're living in an era of an all-volunteer, very highly trained professional armed force, you would think, okay, well, this should make it easier for our leaders now to wage precisely that kind of limited, protracted, perhaps, conflict, cabinet war, if you will, for limited goals, because the people as a whole are not being asked to sacrifice. You would think that would be the case if you follow the logic of what I've been saying, or the logic of history. But it seems not to be the case. And that's where I was confused there when I said, I can't explain this. We, the American people, seem to be more sensitive to casualty numbers in an era of all-volunteer forces and really relatively low casualty numbers compared to the big wars that we've had to fight. And I can't explain why that is. Does anybody have any thoughts about that? Why do we worry about 3,000 dead in Iraq? We didn't worry. What were the casualties in Korea, David? Can you recall, roughly?
54.
54? And Vietnam was 58, right? Something like that?
Just in response to that, I think part of it is a big influence of the media. I mean, the media got a lot of the blame for, our involvement in Vietnam and getting out of Vietnam. If you had CNN live at the beach on Normandy, Americans would have said, forget it, bring the troops home. Eisenhower's an idiot. He's just leading them into the slaughter. If you had headline news covering Grant's campaign in the Civil War, they would have agreed with the newspapers at the time that were calling him a butcher of men and so forth. I think if, today with the nonstop news and every hour on CNN, an American has been killed today in Iraq. If you had that in the past, I mean, maybe there's the benefit of the doubt, but I don't think there'd be the stomach for those kind of casualties if you had that constant focus on it.
That's a fascinating point, and I kind of wish we had another 20 minutes and that David were up here on a panel with me to address that issue, because he's the expert on media and communications at the Annenberg School of Communications at Penn. That's a very, very interesting point, and if you attribute it to the media, and I don't have to say blame it on the media, just attribute it to the fact that we have instantaneous global communications now, then of course that brings up the whole question of censorship. And then you say to yourself, well, then the solution to making the American public more tolerant of casualties that may be needed in a given conflict means we should impose censorship. And then you get back, then you come around again to the whole question of civil versus military values, and immediately Congress, with no sympathy for what the military has to face, is immediately going to say dictatorship, fascism, we can't have that in America. The freedom of the press is one of our holiest values, right? And we're seeing this played out in Iraq, obviously, on the give and take every single day of, the media don't report the good news, the media are biased, the media are missing so many stories. No, they're not. In fact, we don't even know the real number of Iraqi deaths because the government won't tell us or nobody knows, and we're not allowed to cover that story. And so it goes back and forth on a daily basis, and frankly, in an extremely tiresome way. And so the trend there is definitely dangerous, because what you tend to do when you get angry at the media, or you get distrustful of the media, or you just plain get frustrated, is you end up choosing as consumers whatever news you want to hear. And so we've had this terrible situation. People have said, well, the main networks, the main media have always been liberal. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But it's certainly true now that we have Fox, pointing the conservative point of view, and then we have CNN with a liberal point of view, and it's going to end up being like a European situation in the 1920s or 30s, where you have your fascist newspaper and your conservative newspaper, your socialist newspaper, and your communist newspaper, and no one ever reads anybody else's news, and the news itself, of course, becomes more and more propaganda. And that, too, is a long-term threat, or it's a long-term threat to the health of our republic.
We have time. Did you want to?
I was going to ask a question.
Okay, then you'll have the last question.
Well, I want to add to the conundrum.
Okay, well, I suppose that's a good thing to do in the first session. I hope we don't arrive at conundrums in our last session.
Conundrum, it seems to me that there is a theme there's a sort of duality in your presentation, whether we want to fight wars, whether we're peace-loving. We recognize military service or national service as virtuous, but we have not adopted it unless it is necessary. Now, my question is, you're an historian, but you're also an observer and a commentator on current affairs and so forth. What would we do with a civilian army today? I understand the desire to inculcate ideals of public service in people, but what would we do with such a thing? Can you foresee circumstances developing in the outer world and so forth that would require this in some way of Americans?
Well, what would we do with a large drafted army? It obviously is a very good question, because, as I explained, the Pentagon doesn't want conscripted soldiers anymore. It doesn't need them. They would cost too much to train, and particularly short-term soldiers who would be leaving in 2 or 3 years. It just isn't worth it to the Pentagon, so as I understand it, to conscript soldiers. But if you had national service and you made that one of your options, then what would you do with these people? I mean, even the Chinese, or I wouldn't say even the Chinese, who I guess had the largest army in the world there, the PLA, for several decades, they can't wait to get all these soldiers out of the army. If they can figure out, find jobs for them, in the civil economy, they're desperately trying to downsize their personnel in their military, even as they boost their military spending and so forth. Some people have suggested that we need more boots on the ground in places like Iraq, if only for peacekeeping purposes. So maybe we should train up large forces to function sort of as MPs. To occupy foreign countries or failed states, or engage in humanitarian interventions. But then that always made me uncomfortable, because I don't want to dull the war-fighting edge of our armed forces. So other people have suggested, okay, well then let's have a new department of government, or a new uniformed service of some kind that is dedicated to that task of peacekeeping, peacemaking, and so forth. But I'm not the person to answer that. We'd have to have a personnel expert from that's way above my pay grade to make decisions of that kind.
Thank you very much, Walter.